Good morning, everybody. We need to get started because Pat has a very full schedule for us today. Welcome to the uh, first forum of the year. Welcome to our guests. Just want to make two announcements. Just want to make the first announcement that the September 22nd forum, which was going to be our youth talking about diversity, that had to be canceled for circumstances that we couldn't control. And the other, of course, is to announce the September 29th conference, which is Windsor Wade. He had participated in a Veterans for Peace walk from Algonquin, Maine to DC to urge an end to the war in Gaza. So he'll be speaking on September 29th about that experience. And next week, of course, we do not have a forum because there will be a celebration of the 50th, one of the celebrations of the 50th anniversary. So without further ado, Pat Tweet will introduce our speakers today.
And the advanced thing has stopped working again, so, okay. All right, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all. We have three people here to speak to you. Dr. Michelle Laura Flood is from St. John Fisher University, and Dr. Rashid Mohammed is from the Community Partnerships for Just Cause. And then you know me. So I'm going to read some brief biographies, and then I'm going to start with hopefully some comments to set up Dr. Flood's remarks about the problem of DEI, how it's being dismantled across the United States. So Dr. Michelle Laura Flood is currently a professor at St. John Fisher University in the Media and Communication Department. She earned her PhD in Communication Studies from the University of Iowa in 2022. She is trained as a rhetorician, but specializing in media studies. Her research examines the relationship between popular culture and social justice. Her work has been published in journals like Women's Studies in Communication and Feminist Media Studies. And she recently finished working on the 14th edition of a textbook called Gendered Lives, Communication, Gender, and Culture with her PhD advisor. Her upcoming book project will interrogate the relationship between the phenomenon, celebrity, and contemporary feminisms. And Dr. Rashid Mohammed is the Director of Community Partnerships for Just Cause, formerly Volunteer Legal Services Project of Monroe County. Rashid has over 40 years of professional experience as a military officer, aerospace engineering manager, interfaith commission chair, nonprofit operations director, and community dialogue moderator. He has worked closely with a wide array of diverse government, corporate, academic, nonprofit, and community organizations. Rashid is a retired United States Air Force officer, having served over 20 years on active duty. He is also a retired aerospace engineering and program manager, having worked at L3Harris Corporation's Space and Intelligence Systems Division. Prior to working at Just Cause, Rashid was the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative RMAPI Director of Operations. He earned his doctorate from St. John Fisher College with fieldwork at the Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence under the guidance of Ms. Kit Miller. Rashid is also an adjunct professor at St. John Fisher University. The son of Judge Roy W. King, Rashid was born in Syracuse and raised in Rochester. Since retiring from the Air Force, he's pursued his passion for community building activities. From 2005 to 2012, Rashid served as the University of Rochester's volunteer Muslim chaplain. Currently, he's a member and the past chair of the Commission on Jewish-Muslim Understanding. Working at Just Cause presents Rashid ample opportunities to continue serving his community and country. Rashid is married to the lovely Mrs. Monica Mohammed, his wife of 35 years and past chair of the Commission on Christian-Muslim Relations. Rashid and Monica have two wonderful daughters, Aisha, PhD student at the University of North Carolina, and Khadijah, ESL, ELL teacher in the Syracuse City Schools. In addition to his family, Rashid's main interests include mentoring emerging leaders, American studies and history, military science, cultural geography, enjoying New York State's lovely fall and winter splendor, and suffering immensely as a Buffalo Bills fan. Okay, and just to let you know a little bit about myself, Dr. Patricia E. Tweet has been an independent researcher since May of 2020, when she completed 28 years of teaching sociology at the college level, first with a master's degree and since 2003 with her doctorate in sociology. During her teaching career, she developed and taught courses for sociology majors, students pursuing other majors, and for students preparing for careers in human services and public health. This included urban sociology, groups and diversity, prejudice, personality and culture, populations, programs and health, and class, status, and power. Her research over the last 4 years has focused on the siting and production of affordable housing by faith-based nonprofit organizations. She has been a member of DUPSI since 1991 and currently serves on the session, the finance team, and the DEIB committee, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So our plan for today is Dr. Flood will be talking about rhetorical strategies of anti-DEIB that politicians have used this year as compared to the rhetorical strategies deployed by pro-DEIB groups. So the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee have provided plenty of material in this area. Dr. Mohammed will be speaking very briefly at the very end because he wants to give you a community announcement about a volunteer opportunity. And he's going to be telling you about the Judicial Observation Project, which is something that is dedicated to uncovering and addressing implicit bias in our judicial system. Okay, so let's see if this, yeah, all right. So a wave of anti-DEIB laws across America. So first, just to explain, it's not that long ago, it's within the lifetimes of most of the people in this room, that we desegregated public high schools and then colleges and universities. Okay, so you might recall in '62, President Kennedy had to send federal marshals to support the enrollment of the first Black students at Ole Miss, right, in historically white institutions. Kennedy also initiated the requirement of affirmative action for employers receiving government contracts. And then the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act by Congress outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, public education, and employment. And that act also created the Commission on Civil Rights and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. President Johnson's 1965 executive order also required affirmative action. But because affirmative action was not clearly defined, colleges and universities would sometimes implement it by setting aside seats for racial minorities. So in 1978, in the Bakke case, the Supreme Court ruled that quotas were not legal, that they violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So in the Bakke case, he was a white 40-year-old engineer who applied to UC Davis Medical School. And he believed that he had been passed over for Black students to be admitted to the medical school. But as you know, medical schools and selective colleges and universities are very competitive. So the fact is, every year, many white and Black and all candidates are being passed over. But he made an appeal and the Supreme Court upheld his case. Okay, so what happens to affirmative action? In 1996, California voters approved this proposition that said, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Okay, so that's the beginning of the end of affirmative action, starting in the state of California. And California tried to take it another step by passing the Racial Privacy Initiative, which sought to prohibit the state of California from classifying any individual by race, ethnicity, color, or national origin. The initiative did exempt data collected for medical research in descriptions of prisoners or crime suspects, and in cases where the federal government requires that agencies report racial data. Now, the American Sociological Association at that time issued a statement opposing the initiative, arguing for the importance of data collection, even though racial categories are partly socially constructed. And actually, that initiative was defeated. But carrying forward into 2023, the Supreme Court finally strikes down affirmative action in colleges and universities altogether by ruling in favor of Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina. Now, because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, students cannot be excluded on the basis of race. But if students decline to apply to or attend institutions where they're going to be really obvious minorities, those institutions are now limited in what they can do to attract them. So some of you might remember this presidential administration. Okay, it kind of rolled the clock back. And as you can see, there was one woman and one person of color on President Reagan's presidential cabinet. So, you know, don't need diversity here. In contrast, we have President Obama's cabinet. And President Obama had 8 women, 3 Black Americans, 1 Asian American, and 1 Hispanic American. Okay, so he embraced diversity. Moving ahead to a recent presidential administration, we're back to 2 women and 1 African American. So now we have what we would call the contemporary attack on DEI. And Dr. Flood's going to go into this in great detail. So just by way of introducing it, once again, you have these laws that have these names that sound like they're civil rights, equal opportunity, right? But really what that means is you can't have a diversity office, you can't have diversity statements, you can't have diversity training in your colleges and universities and in state government. Okay. So that's happening on a statewide, state by state basis. So this past June, a month prior to his selection as the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party, Senator J.D. Vance, along with members of the House of Representatives, introduced a federal Dismantle DEI Act. Now, some people in some states, such as Kentucky, even though the state defeated the DEIB bill, says, I know where this is going. Let's just, you know, take it down now. So that's what they did at Kentucky. They disbanded their Office of Institutional Diversity and replaced it with a new Office for Community Relations. Okay, and now the university will no longer mandate diversity training and is removing diversity statements from hiring documents. So I'd just like to comment briefly about what a diversity statement is in case you don't know. So I applied for a job this past January that made a diversity statement optional, and I submitted one, okay? Didn't get the job, okay? I don't know why. They didn't tell me why I didn't get it, but here's my feeling. If the one reason I didn't get it was because somebody else wrote a better diversity statement, then that's what I want to happen in America. I would rather they had the job and make America a better country than I get it. So, diversity statements. Okay, so while some have denounced DEI as cumbersome and onerous bureaucracy, Senator Vance went further. And he made this comment. The DEI agenda is a destructive ideology that breeds hatred and racial division. It has no place in our federal government or anywhere else in our society. Okay, so we've come a long way from President Kennedy saying, let's have affirmative action, to Vance saying that DEI is an ideology, it's destructive, and it makes trouble. It breeds racial division. So what are we talking about here? Okay, across the country, you've had all these bills introduced. You have 12 states where they have been passed into law. You also have a number of states where the bills have been defeated. And then you have states such as New York and California where no such law has been introduced. So that's a good thing to know, that there are some states that are not on the warpath against DEI. However, it's kind of interesting if you look at a map of how diverse America is. There are states where it's 90% white. There are states where it's 80% white. Okay. So if in fact you look at the states that have passed anti-DEI bills, over half of them are in states that have 80% or more white residents. Of states where racial minorities were 40% or more, only Florida and Texas passed anti-DEI bills. So in short, the legislators and governors signing these bills into law are in states that have the least experience with and are possibly less interested in diversity. Okay, so why do we need to pay attention to diversity? Well, there's this thing, it's called racial disparities in America, and it happens in at least 6 areas. We have problems of a Black maternal mortality rate, which is 2.6 times higher than for non-Hispanic whites. In policing, Black people are 2.9 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. We have toxin-producing refineries and waste management facilities, which are disproportionately sited in Black and Latino neighborhoods. This is factual. This is not an opinion. We also have inequalities in wealth accumulation, median Black household wealth being $44,000, $45,000. For whites, it's $285,000. Asian Americans have $536,000. And then in terms of housing, of the people who are living below poverty line, this is a local example. So in the 9-county Rochester region, although Black and Hispanic people are just 10.7% and 4.5% of the population, within the Black and Latino communities, we have poverty rates that are 34 and 33%. And what this pans out to is in Monroe County, where you have only 50,000 rental units for 96,000 poor people, and just a few more in the towns of Greece and Brighton, okay? You have people, who have to double up and pay exorbitant amounts of rent and sometimes find themselves in shelters because there's just not sufficient housing. And the burden falls on the communities of color. And then in terms of schooling, in 2005, Jonathan Kozol called it the shame of the nation, the restoration of apartheid schooling in America. So busing didn't work, so we'll just migrate wherever we are. And as a result, in our community, city residents attend majority Black schools, while just across the line, suburban schools are majority white. And there's a wonderful book written by a local reporter, Justin Murphy, that gives you the whole story in great detail. So why so much animosity towards diversity? Well, here's an example. So in the state of Utah, there's a state senator who heard from state representative. She heard from constituents. They were complaining because their children were being required to write diversity statements when applying for medical schools. And the representative says, it doesn't seem right, doesn't belong in an application. So as we know, Utah is one of the states that now outlawed those diversity statements. But here's some facts for you, okay? This 2016 article published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science says that we have evidence that there is racial bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations, and that there are false beliefs about biological differences between Blacks and whites. And as we'll see, it's not just lay people, it's doctors. It's medical students and residents, okay? So for their study, they did a survey and they got, they selected for white respondents who were born in the United States and native speakers. They got 92 lay people, and they got a bunch of medical students and 28 residents. And these are some of the questions they were asked. Do you think that Blacks age more slowly than whites? Do whites have larger brains than Blacks? Are Blacks, do they have skin that is thicker than whites? Are whites less susceptible to heart disease than Blacks? Now, as it happens, there are some true facts sprinkled among here, okay? So the true statements and the percent believing. So the fact that whites are suffering from heart disease less than Blacks, well, 43% of lay people think that's true. And second-year med students really know this, 83%. But by the time they get to be residents, they're not believing it as much. That's pretty interesting, right? 42% of lay people knew that Black people are less likely to contract spinal cord diseases. The med students know that. So the residents, but not as many as the med students. Blacks have denser, stronger bones than whites. This is factual. This is research-based. Lay people, a third of them know that. The med students know this. Look what happens to the residents. From their second year in med school to, their first year on the job, they've stopped believing. It's fact. It's research-based. Okay, and then whites are less likely than Blacks to have a stroke. Lay people, a third know this. 2/3 med students know it. The residents are dropping off. How about those false statements? The larger brains, this thicker skin, the coagulating blood, okay? Lay people think these things, right? Some second-year med students think these things. Fortunately, the residents know that this is not factual, okay? Although there's still a few. So 73% of lay people agreed with at least one false belief, as did 50% of the medical students and residents. And after completing medical school, as you saw, the residents seemed to know less than the second-year students about real racial differences. So then they had the respondents rate their pain in a scenario, and then the pain of a Black person who might have had the same situation. And the lay people and medical students and residents who believed more of the false statements rated the pain of a Black person lower, thus seeming to assume that Black bodies are stronger than whites. And medical students and residents high in false beliefs also recommended less accurate treatment for patients. So in other words, when you have this information, this is why it's useful for medical students, right? People applying for medical school to realize that they need to learn some facts if they don't already know some, and that there's always new facts, so you should always be studying, right? So the idea of just erasing diversity statements from medical schools seems very poorly thought out to me. You should also know, I'm not going to do all of the 6 areas of disparities, but you should also understand that with respect to environmental protections, there is a judge that was appointed under President Trump's administration who says that it's no longer correct to consider the impact on Black communities of the locations of polluting facilities because this judge writes, pollution does not discriminate. And if a regulating authority has to consider race in its enforcement making, it will be participating in racism. Okay, so that's the kind of mentality, language, argument that we need to understand is happening because people say DEI is a wrong thing. Okay, and I have a couple other items, but I feel like I've gone past my 15 minutes and I want to turn this over now to Dr. Flood. So if we could pull up the
so much. I am not nearly as tall as Dr. Tweet. Okay, there we go. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Flood. I am an assistant professor of practice at St. John Fisher University. Relatively new to the Rochester area. My spouse and I moved here last year for this job from the greater Seattle area. Dr. Muhammad had a wonderful, personal spiel. And so a few fun facts about like myself and my family. We're currently expecting our first child. So thank you for your patience as I'm heavily pregnant right now. But in my research at the University of Iowa, I specialized in rhetorical criticism. So as a trained rhetorician, I look at pop culture and media studies. And my particular areas of interest are celebrity culture and thinking about the ways that pop culture reflects back onto us what we find culturally salient and valuable, either through valorization or objection. I feel very lucky to be a professor at St. John Fisher because I really like having these difficult conversations with undergraduate students about DEI, about these topics, just kind of understand both how they understand the world at this point in their lives, but also help them to be a little bit more prepared to inherit the world as it is. And so as such, I teach a lot of diversity classes or diversity related classes at Fisher. And then, as Dr. Tweet explained, I recently finished a textbook with my PhD advisor. And actually it's a textbook project that in its 14th edition will be coming out later this year. The first edition came out a year after I was born, 32 years ago, written at first by my academic grandmother. And I'm currently I'm in conversation with a few publishers for my first book project. So I was so delighted to be asked to speak today about the rhetoric of anti-DEB or DEIB, excuse me. And I just wanted to pull forward a few of the rhetorical strategies and some of the things that anti-DEI legislators and pro-DEI legislators are using as they discuss these ongoing issues of diversity and particularly at this great moment of cultural impasse. So I am going to go in depth on, would you advance, please? Okay, awesome. Great. So as we've seen in the last 2 years in particular, there are significant efforts to pass legislation at the state and federal level to dismantle the DEI efforts and DEIB. Excuse my slippage here. I love that you all are adding B to the acronym. I don't know that the popular discourse is there yet, but I think B is important. In preparing for this lecture, I really believe that the idea of equity versus equality is the rhetorical impasse. And so that's a little bit of what we're focusing on today. And some of the language that we're going to examine is going to sort of point at some of the discomfort that these legislators have implicitly expressed with certain populations of our diverse country. So Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance has introduced over the summer the Dismantle DEI Act of 2024. He, in collaboration with a few other congressmen, have been working very hard to advocate for federal legislation that would mirror what's happened at the state level and in states like Texas and Florida. This one in particular highly resembles the work done by Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill, right? The Florida's Stop WOKE Act. And so JD Vance's Dismantle DEI Act would prohibit DEI practices on 3 separate tiers. Yes. Oh, why am I advancing? Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Well, I thought that it was just a word, but I see there that it has. I see that woke has periods after it, so I'm wondering what is the meaning? Is there another meaning of that?
Well, I mean, it's a very clever acronym, right? So that is
It is an acronym.
It's, I mean, they intend to spell out woke. I don't know what the actual, which each, like, how they constructed that, acronym.
That happened afterwards.
Yes.
Okay,
right.
woke was the original term,
Yes.
and then in order to make the bill, they
Yes.
did this. Okay,
was
I
very-
just wondered if it had always had some other meaning. Thank you.
Very creative on their part. The word woke comes from African American English Vernacular, AAVE, and it means just to be aware of, racial tensions and, alive and well discrimination in the United States. And so Stop Woke Act was intentionally named as such because it's become sort of a derogatory buzzword to talk about the ways in which people are aware of systemic and institutional injustice, right? So back to Vance's Dismantle DEI Act, he proposes that we prohibit DEI practice on 3 separate prongs at the federal level. So this would include any activity that would count as discriminating for or against any person on the basis of race, color, ethnicity, religion, biological sex, or national origin. Anyone in the audience see what's missing in that statement? Gender, right? And sexuality as well, right? And so a lot of these anti-DEI legislative acts really focus on race as its pivotal, as its crux. But I think it's pretty telling here that gender identity versus biological sex, that's a choice, right? As well as sexuality is completely omitted. And so I don't think that is a coincidence. And like the Stop Woke Act, like the Don't Say Gay Act, it would also completely eliminate any required trainings or educational modules or ongoing, classes in higher education that would talk about systemic oppression and privilege. Basically, you wouldn't be able to talk with your coworkers or your colleagues or your students, like in my case, about what it means to be born into systemic privilege. And that's kind of tricky there too. And then the last prong would require that no federal agency who employs or educates would be allowed to require those employees or those students to sign a code of conduct that supports DEI. So as Dr. Tweet was saying, the diversity statements that are very commonplace in the workforce now, particularly in academia, those would be completely eradicated from the application process, but also they would not be allowed to be part of your performance evaluation or your understanding of how you can interact with your coworkers in the workplace. Any questions here? Okay. All right, so, and then advancing here. All right. So the penalties for the Dismantle DEI Act of 2024, should it pass, was that anybody found in violation of those three prongs that I previously described would receive less federal funding. They would receive significant cuts. And this would also require that we undo and do away with the DEI offices, the employees who are hired to encourage and implement DEI initiatives in the workplace. And this would include, federal agencies like the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. And so this would have significant impact on a variety of different workplaces, but also in higher education. And I think Dr. Tweet and I pulled the same exact quote because this is sort of Vance's thing right now, where he, has said the DEI agenda is a destructive ideology that breeds hatred and racial division. Americans' tax dollars should not be co-opted to spread this radical and divisive ideology. And so what I want to pull forward from this quote here is the dog whistle terminology he's using to really sort of assert that any difficult or uncomfortable conversations about difference, whether that's racial, gendered, based on sexuality, based on socioeconomic difference, ability, et cetera, that we shouldn't have to have uncomfortable conversations, that we shouldn't have to talk about difference. And so some of these terms, the DEI agenda, right? Agenda implying that it's something something with nefarious intent involved. Breeds, I think that is in particular is a dog whistle term because that, talks about that alludes to reproduction and could potentially be connected to, eugenics, and division. We are at a moment of a prolonged moment of extreme political and cultural division, right? And I think that he's picking up this term that's used for people on all ends of the political spectrum to point fingers at who's creating the division. And in this case, it's people who believe that racial injustice is alive and well in the United States. He's also using the word co-opted, radical, divisive, and then my favorite, ideology. I love how the word ideology has become a buzzword in popular discourse because we would think of ideology as a set of principles, a set of ideas that we can explore, interrogate, and perhaps find some value in. But ideology used here as this buzzword has been rhetorically transformed to be more so positioned as some sort of pseudoscience or some, wacky, quirky, false sense of beliefs that dupe people into cult-like thinking. Yes, it is absolutely propaganda. Yeah. And so I can understand why politicians like J.D. Vance truly believe that DEI and have asking people, particularly at the federal level, to have these difficult conversations. I can understand why, that he's proposing this legislation. But I think I truly think that it's the language he's using, and the language that's included in the bill or in the act itself demonstrates whose comfort is being privileged, whose comfort's being prioritized, and whose rights are deprioritized as well. And so I position equity as the rhetorical impasse here. This is a question of equality versus equity. And I think that anti-DEIB rhetoric, is one of those things where it plays into what I believe to be a rhetorical fallacy of the American dream, that if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything, right? And I think it's pretty widely understood that we all come from different walks of life, that we've all had different opportunities, and we've all had different struggles based on who we are and how we're socially located within the world. So the ACLU, and I realize whoops, should have proofread that. But the senior attorneys, particularly Watson at the ACLU, are incensed by this Dismantle DEI Act, and they position it as an attempt to quote unquote whitewash America's history of racial subjugation and to reverse efforts that pursue racial justice. And so I believe that anti-DEIB rhetoric conflates equality with equity, arguing that institutional and systemic advantage or disadvantage, these are things that just don't exist, and that all Americans have the same access to opportunity. So I want to linger here just for a little bit, because in having these difficult conversations with my students at Fisher, I think that it's much easier for them to rally around the idea of equality. One, because it's comforting and it's much more comfortable, right? We all have the same opportunities. We're all born in this great land, and that, you know, if you work hard enough, this idea of the meritocracy, that you can be whatever you want to be. But when I talk to them about equity, I can see the wheels starting to turn. I can see them. There's a particularly salient graphic about, I don't know if you've seen it, the baseball, right? And like who can see over the fence to watch the baseball game. So equality means that each individual or each group of people is given the same resources or opportunities, versus equality recognizes that everybody is born into different circumstances, or by the circumstances of their lives, that, you know, they don't have equal access. And therefore equity allocates resources and opportunities that are necessary in order to reach equal outcome. So it's really a question of the starting point versus the ending point. Does everyone have the same chance? Or what can we do to make the playing field a little bit more level? So interestingly enough, I want to pivot to what's happened at the DNC in the last few weeks. And as you know, Kamala Harris has assumed the Democratic presidential candidacy. It's just been a wild summer. It was quite a whiplash of a summer politically. I want to pivot here because of some of the language used against her, and also some of the rhetorical strategies that her campaign is using, which I find particularly surprising. I'm not sure how many of you saw Barbie last year, but I just finished writing a book chapter on an edited collection on women in leadership and pop culture. And so I wrote this chapter analyzing the misogynoir of President Barbie in Barbie film, right? She's just kind of an empty signifier. She doesn't do much. She's easily subverted by the Ken's patriarchy. But it was so important to focus on like what it would look like to have the first Black woman be president. And so now that that's a potential tangible reality as we enter election season, some of the rhetorical strategies both used against Kamala Harris and in her own campaign have been really surprising. You know, I know that she's experienced this buzzword, this key term throughout her political or her career, both as a prosecutor and as a legislator, where she's been referred to as a DEI hire, where she's been referred to, despite having a very illustrious CV and just a political career that has spanned decades. Certain people, like Tennessee Congressman Timothy Burchett, have called her a DEI hire, right? Which is, again, another dog whistle term. I don't even think it can be called dog whistle at that point. I think that's like explicitly, I think that's explicitly discriminatory. Which is, you know, this is a term that's weaponized against people from marginalized communities to quote unquote defend meritocracy, to imply that they haven't earned what they currently have, or that they are unqualified for the position of power that they hold, right? And so calling Vice President Kamala Harris a DEI hire really rhetorically positions her as being unqualified and mediocre. Now we could problematize Vice President Harris's campaign all we want, the lack of policy statement, really reluctance to engage in interviews and to really talk about what's happening. The DNC was quite fun. The media strategy used by her campaign, absolutely bonkers. I think they're doing so much to bring in Gen Z as a voting population in really exciting ways, but we don't really know much about who she is as a presidential candidate yet, right? And so one thing that happened as a result of her first interview, which happened, I believe, last week or about 10 days or so, the only interview she's given to date was with CNN. And at the very, very end of this interview, she's asked about what it would mean to be the first Black woman to serve as president of the United States. So she's asked the quote unquote DEI hire question. Do we know if the video is working? I can also just read off the manuscript. Okay. Nope. Okay. So the interviewer asks, quote unquote, "And last question, Madam Vice President, the photograph that has gone viral, and she's referring to the photo where she's accepting the nomination for president, and her grandniece is watching her from the stands, and it's this,
The photograph
there we go.
that has gone viral. You were speaking, one of your grandnieces that you were just talking
Yes.
about was watching you accept the nomination. You didn't explicitly talk about gender or race in your speech, but it obviously means a lot to a lot of people, and that viral picture really says it. What does it mean to you?
You know, I am running because I believe that I am the best person to do this job at this moment. For all Americans, regardless of race and gender. But I did see that photograph and I was deeply touched by it. And you're right, it's the back of her head, two little braids, and then I'm in the front of the photograph, obviously speaking. And it's very humbling. It's very humbling in many ways.
So that is the very end of her CNN interview. That is exactly how they ended it. And you can tell that she shies away from talking about how her unique experiences at the intersections of race and gender, which have accumulated into misogynoir, the Black misogyny experienced by Black women, or racial misogyny, excuse me. She doesn't want to talk about that. And I think that that's very interesting. I think it's probably an unfortunately prudent choice. I think it's a necessity, because if she were to publicly talk about her race and her gender and the unique experience that it's given her, throughout her career, and also at this moment when she is one of the most visible people in the United States, I don't think that would help her numbers. I don't think that would help her popularity as we head into the election. And I think that it would also, strengthen politicians' work, like J.D. Vance, like Ron DeSantis, all of these legislators who are working so hard to pass anti-DEI legislation and to stop these conversations about difference and to make people feel as comfortable as possible. She's playing into this necessity for comfort, because I think in part the survival of her campaign, which has already been a whirlwind and has already been very contentious, depends upon it. And so if she's elected in November, we'll see what happens. But I wouldn't be shocked if she continues to shy away from it, simply because it would be monumental for her to be elected, but she'll be up against the question of re-election in 4 years from now. Right. So thank you. All right, my slides. Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Flood, and thank you, Dr. Tweet. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to come speak with you this morning. I will give a brief update on a local program and then switch hats and go into my St. John professor role, as Dr. Flood did as well. Some very, very important comments that are indicative of the times that we live in. If we look historically, not only in American history, but other societies, we are at an inflection point. And we're going to have to make a decision as a country which way we're going to go. But let me start off with the program that I would like to talk about, and that is the Judicial Observation Program, which is a partnership between the United Christian Leadership Ministry, run here locally. Some of you may be familiar with some of those people. Absolutely. They meet in this building, and also a partnership of the 7th Judicial District. The 7th Judicial District is one of the judicial districts in the New York State court system. So it's divided by regional geographies. The 7th is here centered in Monroe County, but all the adjacent counties down to the New York State, Pennsylvania border. Whenever I have the privilege of speaking in public, there's three things that I would like to encourage people to do, especially in the season that we are in. Number one, vote. Please vote. Last fall in our municipal and county elections, we only had 13%, 13% of the people in the city of Rochester vote. And when we have discussions on holding politicians, elected politicians, into office, people sometimes would like to do this reactively. How can we stop them from doing this, that, or the other? And my thing is, don't let them come into office. Don't let them come into the office. And I'm speaking anywhere you are on the political spectrum, vote for what you believe in. And we know many, many people for hundreds of years worked very hard. Several of them sacrificed their lives in order for us to have the right to vote. The other thing is, please serve on juries. Jury diversification is a huge problem. We have people that are not informed, not because they are unwitting or not intelligent, but they simply have not had access or experience with the jury system. If we have juries that are not diversified on many arrays of humanity, then we can see how the justice system can become skewed or unfair simply because of the jury process. That is a key thing. And lastly, the third thing I would like to mention and encourage everybody to do is to read the United States Constitution, especially the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the New York State Constitution. Many times when we are in discussions, we will talk about de facto types of things, people's beliefs, their behaviors at a personal level, but we will not talk about the de jure things that are in place by systemic laws, policies, and structures which create and hold in place many of the inequities that are there. So if we do not understand the documents that have been intentionally created, which create these structures, we cannot move forward. And I'm one of those weird people that will sit around and read the New York State tax code and those types of things, but they are indeed very, very important to understand. Well, let me start with the Judicial Observation Program. The JOP, or Judicial Observation Program, is to address and educate on implicit bias. To this end, this program is established to focus on implicit bias in the courtroom. As we all know, the judicial branch is one of the three branches of government, along with the legislative and the executive branch. The volunteers, the people that would like to participate in this program, and that can be anybody from the community, gets to observe judges. Here in Monroe County, we have the judges within the city court, the county court, the Supreme Court, and the towns and villages. We have opportunity to observe them in their courtroom proceedings and also provide them feedback as a cohort. Now, we cannot provide individual feedback to judges because of ethics rules or on particular cases, but generally, how are they disposing themselves in a courtroom setting? And are they unwitting of their of some sort of implicit bias potentially? The volunteers are trained in courtroom procedures, also implicit bias and how to recognize it, dialogue processes, how to have good and constructive dialogue. And the essence of the JOP is a fair and judicial process for all. And it is inclusive. We will consider anybody to come and participate. However, it is not polemical, is not to create adverse or animosity. We really are looking to learn, and we are going into our fourth cohort. And I could say with the first three cohorts, it's been a wonderful experience, both for the judges and the community volunteers that participate. And lastly, we'll say about this is that there is some time commitment. We do ask people to go through a 6-week process, a couple of training sessions, an hour and a half over 6 weeks, 1 hour and a half each week, to learn about implicit bias and those dialogue sessions. And then when we move into January through March is when we do the actual court observations. At the end of that, as a cohort, we put together our feedback, and then we meet with the judges over a luncheon and discuss what our findings are. So if anybody is interested in that, I have flyers with the information, and I will leave that along with some other information on our legal services if you want to share that in the surrounding county communities. If there are any questions about the JOP right now, I would like to open that up. Yes, sir.
Just the teaching and the implicit.
Uh,
bias.
we have the Monroe County DEIB officer. She teaches the implicit bias sessions.
Okay, so she's an employee of the city,
County.
county.
She is the county DEIB
Oh,
officer.
I'm
Uh-huh.
sorry.
Mhm.
Didn't know there was one. What's her name?
I don't,
Okay,
yeah, Cheryl Hayward. Thank you.
tell her.
Yes.
Thank you.
That is it, Cheryl Hayward. Yeah. And she is a very, very accomplished and quite, thank you for remembering, like, my mind goes blank sometimes. Cheryl is absolutely wonderful, very, very knowledgeable. Any other questions about the JOP?
Is it too soon to be able to evaluate what the effects have been?
Yes, well, quantitatively, we could do things, how many judges participated in that type of stuff. Qualitatively, on the volunteer side, we've already had some findings about people are much more aware of the court system, can discriminate about the different types of judicial processes and be able to share that. With the judges, they have all uniformly come back and said, the feedback that you gave us about certain types of things that they were unaware of, they really appreciate that and have modified some of their behaviors based on that. Well, with that, I would like to change hats or rub my bald head and just go back and do a little bit of reinforcement with the wonderful things that Dr. Tweet and Dr. Flood said. Number one, systemic and de jure driven processes. JD Vance, and let me say this, I am not speaking on behalf of the 7th Judicial District or any government entity. These are my opinions, Rashid Muhammad. JD Vance, Ron DeSantis, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, all of these people have a certain thing in common. Not only are they cisgendered heterosexual white males, they are all Ivy League trained lawyers. Lawyers created the Constitution. Lawyers created the systemic types of things. When we see in the history of the Civil Rights Act, it was lawyers that went methodically and dismantled these things. I encourage people, I cannot be any more serious or pleading to please read the Constitution of the United States and the New York State Constitution. These are the things that hold, create, and hold in place. All of these people are extremely intelligent. They're extremely capable. The rhetoric that Dr. Flood was talking about, they use that intentionally to do things, and then they reinforce it with the de jure policies, like the Woke Act and those types of things. So instead of their, everyday type of person, working type families, that type of stuff, they are actually Ivy League elites that know what they're doing to dismantle things. Another thing I would like to bring in that term and bring that forward. We're celebrating the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. But in 1974, Supreme Court decision, Milliken versus Bradley, which looked at discrimination in the Detroit area, and that Supreme Court decision absolutely, almost totally undid Brown versus the Board of Education. Many people have not heard of that. When that Supreme Court decision, 5-4, when that was decided by justices that were put in place by President Nixon, just like we see now, justices that have been put in place by President Trump, said, yes, you have to desegregate that district, but only within the district. You cannot do it with any surrounding other metropolitan areas. So districts that are already homogeneous and you cannot do busing, all that type of stuff, totally almost undid Brown versus the Board of Education. And right now, as mentioned in Mr. Murphy's book, and you can look at other data, the school districts are more segregated than they were before Brown versus the Board of Education. Just please contemplate that for a second. The schools are more segregated now than they were before Brown versus the Board of Education. So these are the types of things that we are trying to share in the academic environment in order to spur critical thinking. So these things are being undone. Dr. Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, another thing I highly suggest people read, shows across the country how systemically both the legislative branches and the judicial and executive branches have put things in place in order to maintain these types of segregation, redlining and all those other things that we hear about, but where's the impetus and foundation for that to come? Two other things that I would also offer. To read the Kerner Commission for Civil Disorders report in 1968. If you take 1968 out and put 2024 in there, we're still there. So as we're going through these cycles where we have Reconstruction, the dismantling of it, we have the Civil Rights Act, the dismantling of it, we have bringing in DEIB and moving more to a more pluralistic and equitable society, we have the dismantling of that, and de jure policies, laws, and structures were the things, are the tools that are being used to undo those types of things and cement power and privilege in place. Now, I like to joke around a little bit, but it's actually very, very serious. Very serious. If Dr. Tweet, Dr. Flood, and myself said we were going to stand here for 6 hours, talk about tax code, talk about rhetoric, talk about inequities, how many people would come and sit here and listen to us for 6 hours? I'm surprised you're all not asleep because of my monotone voice right now. Okay. But if we said Taylor Swift or Beyonce was going to be here, what would happen? What would happen? You have to close the New York State Thruway, the National Guard would have to come out and everything like that. Why is that? Why are we thinking, behaving like that in society? When we think of the struggles across multiple arrays of people have had to literally fight for their rights, many of them died, many of them sacrificed their lives, their careers over several hundred years for us to get here. And if we have anesthetized our minds and inured them to the situation we're in, then we may not be surprised with the outcome. So with that, I leave you hopefully with the thoughts to join the JOP or encourage others to do so. Get involved, of course, with helping people vote, but also encouraging people to look at the systemic and the laws, policies, and structures that hold many of the inequities in place. If I could answer any questions, be glad to do so, or I will be glad to finish.
It seems like we probably only have chance for 1 or 2 questions, and it would be good to maybe open it up to any of the 3 of you. Anybody have questions for Dr. Flood or Dr. Tweet?
Thank you very much for the great and amazing presentations. I'm Kihar. I have a question about DIB. So I think DIB is having 2 kinds of problems these days. One is from the government side that they are trying to dismantle, promoting cultural assimilation, integration, and completely ignoring cultural intelligence and gender and racial issues. But the second problem, which I see is more equally important or serious, is the problem within DIB. So the way we define diversity, I think it's still incomplete. We need to maybe extend the definition of diversity. When we define diversity, we specifically focus few races and few problems, completely ignoring the others. For example, how about other races which cover maybe half of the globe? And how about the different generation gaps? So why don't we talk about different generation? Like there are X, Y, Z, Alpha, and coming up. And
the Constitution of the United States of America was founded explicitly 3/5 clause, okay? The 1808 subject matter about slavery. The foundation of this country, the laws, the policies, the rules or structures are built on white supremacy explicitly against African Americans. If you say focus on this problem is not an exclusion, and I think what you're saying is negating a very serious problem. If we're in a ship and the ship is sinking and has a hole in it, and somebody's talking about rearranging the dinner plates, those are 2 different things. It is not an exclusion. The fact that other people come from this country is an outcome of the 1965 Civil Rights Act, with several things. We had a civil war, 33 million people at the time of this country. We're 330 million people right now. 750,000 people died in that civil war explicitly about white supremacy and slavery. If you think it's my opinion, read the articles of secession from each of the southern states. We are seceding in order to preserve slavery, the inferiority of blacks, and white supremacy. It's not talking about people around the globe. It's talking explicitly the economy of the world economy based on cotton, okay, and banks came from chattel slavery. It is an insult to me and my ancestors to say we're focusing too much on one thing while we're not looking at these other things.
Yeah, my intention was not on this inclination. What I want to say is, so DIB completely maybe needed to be extended. I mean, the definitions, it's not only about adding some other races, also adding the generations, what I was saying, adding about different perspectives, because within one race, so there are different generations, and they also needed to be included. And then there are different viewpoints and perspectives. I think they also needed to be included in the DIB definition. And then belongingness is equally important. So how we value all the races, or whatever races are included in the, for example, constitution, we also need to, I think, value there. For example, in one particular race, without naming any particular race, so there are people who have different perspectives. They are all equal. They should all equally be valued and respected. So, sorry?
Well, I just wondered if Dr. Flood or Dr. Tweet wanted to respond to that. It's probably going to be the last response.
Just to respond, I believe that sort of the impasse that we're kind of talking around here right now is that, right, DEI is under attack, and to continue the ship, analogy that Dr. Muhammad used, whether or not we get to have these difficult conversations is the issue at hand, right? And so I do agree that there are so many parts of DEIB that need to be extended and need to be, more thoughtfully developed, and thinking about what does B mean, what does belonging mean. We do not have a united front as to what DEI means or what it does. However, we're fighting right now for the right to talk about it in many aspects of our lives.
I'm sorry that we have to say this is all the time we have left. I think we could keep going, probably for the 6 hours you talked about. Thank you so much for coming, opening up this topic, and it's open, it's not closed. That's for sure, as far as I'm concerned.